Hello, I'm Claire Owen and I am author of Zed and the Cormorants, which is a young adult novel published by Arachne Press. It's the story of 14-year-old Zed, who moves from London to Cornwall because her dad thinks that a fresh start and a simpler life will be better for her mum's mental health and stop her sister Amy going off the rails. But no one really thinks about Zed and what she needs and wants, and she is pretty devastated to leave behind her life in London and her friends, and riddled with anxiety about starting again down here, a new school, fitting in, and also the isolation of the new house that her father has bought. And when things start to go wrong, both at home and in her local community, she becomes convinced they are under attack from a flock of cormorants living down by the river. It's got ghosts, it's got Cornish history, it's got mythology, it's got romance. It has lots of descriptions of lovely crusty loaves because her family are artisan bakers, and it has environmental issues as well. It's all set around a fictionalised version of the Foy Estuary, which also happens to be where I live. So I'm going to start by reading an extract, which is the first morning when Zed wakes up in her new home. Zed woke up with the sunlight. There were no blinds or curtains at the window, and the first thing she felt was a warm red glow behind her eyelids. When she opened them, in the split second or two before she knew where she was, she focused on the dust dancing around in the square streams of pale yellow light. And then, bam, Cornwall, furry teeth in yesterday's clothes. She pushed the duvet back, slipped on her flip-flops and went downstairs. In the kitchen, the window was open and she could hear crowing, the relentless cock-a-doodle-doo of a rooster over the road. Wasn't that supposed to be a wake-up call in the country? No one else seemed to be taking any notice. Zed yanked open the back door and wandered out into the garden. The grass was lumpy and wet with dew. On the far side of the lawn, the ground fell away towards a stream, and through the weeds she could just make out some flagstones, marking a path down to a little wooden bridge. Her flip-flops squeaked as she made her way towards two weeping willows, just like the ones on Granny Steph's favourite china teacups, their branches draped across the bank, skimming the water. She stepped into the space between them and the trunk, and in a moment the thin leaves rustled back into place, enclosing her entirely. It was like being inside a glistening green tent. Zed dipped her toe in the water, and as it trickled over her feet, the tingle of the nettle stings acquired on her way to the willows quickly faded into numbness. She waded out into the middle, followed the stream past some half-collapsed fencing, the wooden post rotting into the reeds and two slacked barbed wires lying in the mud. Outside their garden, the water got deeper and wider, and she climbed up onto a gravel path running alongside that soon gave way to dried mud, dead leaves and twigs. It led under a huge stone viaduct, the height of at least 3 double-decker buses. Zed sang a few notes as she passed under the arches. The sound swelled, but the stones, damp with gelatinous algae, didn't echo her tune as she hoped they would. The path divided and Zed rejected a sharp right, which rose steeply up the side of the hill, to continue parallel to the water as it opened into a creek, snaking its way through mud and marsh. New little trees growing up through the ferns were dwarfed by huge oaks. Dead branches, silver grey, were knotted with ivy and lay tangled in the undergrowth. A large tree had fallen across the stream. It was covered in pea-green moss. A family of ducks drifted around in lazy circles. Zed watched them for a moment before abandoning her flip-flops in a tuft of ferns and tiptoeing up the trunk. To keep herself steady, she turned 90 degrees and she saw a low stone building by the water's edge. It must be the boathouse Dad had mentioned. As she edged her way further out, her bare feet arching over the soft bark, a crumbling slipway came into view, and beyond that the stream met the wide, flat river. And that boathouse becomes quite an important location in this story. And it's when Zed goes to get the keys from the farmer for the first time, she gets her first inkling of its sinister history. And I'll read that extract now. The farmer came out of his front door as soon as Zed turned into the drive. He marched right up close to her before saying quickly and very quietly, "You come for this?" He glanced around before pulling a key on a chain from his pocket. Yes, please," said Zed, stepping backwards. "Not sure as it be the right thing," he muttered. "You give 'em back any time you want, no need to explain." "I'm sure that won't be necessary," she replied. "No one wanted to go anywhere near," he continued, shaking his head. "Been a long time empty." Yes, so I hear. And I really don't like the place," he said, looking at his muddy boots. "Gives me the jitters, something chronic." "Well, it's only really for storing stuff. But I do need a boat, and I wondered if you know where I might get... Well, best not go down there after dark." Zed remembered that Dad had given her an envelope of banknotes. "Oh," she said, reaching into her pocket, "this is for you." He shook his head again, more vigorously this time. "We'll sort it out later, when I know that you're, all okay." Zed stood there awkwardly. Cordelia had said he needed the money. "Do me a favour instead," he continued, holding out a bag and shaking it. "I got something in here I don't want, and I know Cordelia wouldn't want it either, too many memories, but I can't bring myself to chuck it away. Seems disrespectful somehow, and you don't want to disrespect him. Do something with it, will you, maybe? Take it to the library?" He stuffed the bag into Zed's hand. "They're into local history and always looking for old photographs and that." "Of course," said Zed, taking it. "What is it?" The farmer wiped his hands on his trousers. "Best leave her in there," he replied gruffly. But Zed had already pulled out an old sepia photo in a battered wooden frame. It was a bird like the one she'd seen on the roof, but scrawnier, almost bat-like if you ignored the long snaky neck and the nasty-looking beak. "What is it?" said Zed again, holding up the corner of the frame between her thumb and her forefinger. The farmer stepped back and shuddered. "It's a cormorant," he whispered. "Now take it and go." So as you can see, even under stress, the local farmer recognises the importance of libraries in archiving local history. So I don't want to give away too much of the plot. There are no spoilers here, but suffice it to say the cormorants become fairly central to the story, and it becomes clear that they have a real grudge against humans, and with good cause. When I was researching this, I discovered that in 1910, County Hall in Truro offered a shilling for every cormorant's head because they assumed they were interfering with the fisherman's catch. So lots of people bought these birds, and this went on for quite a few years. It was only in the late 1920s that someone actually bothered to analyse the stomach of a cormorant, and they realised there were no marketable fish there at all. And in fact, it was grey seals who were the real threat. And this seemed such an outrage to me that I wove it into my story. So I have a selection of questions here that you have sent for me to answer, and I will do my best. So the first one is, how much of your own life influences your writing? I think it's fairly inevitable that for any writer, they have to connect to a story on at least an emotional level in order to want to write it. And I certainly feel for Zed a lot. I moved from, I moved at the same age as she did. I was possibly a bit younger, maybe 12, but I moved from Oxford to London. So had to totally experience a new school, a new home. And so I have, I suppose, a lot of things that I wanted to explore around that. But in this case, she's got the added trauma, if you like, of suddenly being thrown into a very, very alien landscape because she's come from a city and she's got all this nature on her doorstep. And the story first came to me when I was walking my dogs along this beautiful stretch of the Foy River, and I looked down into the water. And because I'm sort of comfortable and happy with where I live, I saw these two birds with their wings outstretched and thought how graceful and how poised they looked. But I imagined trying to see them through the eyes of an anxious and already lonely young woman, and actually they were incredibly sinister. So that's where the idea for the story started. When did you know this was the book you wanted to write? Well, interestingly, it was the day after I saw the cormorants on the sandbanks on that stretch of river between Foy and Lostwithiel that I was asked to do a story event at Foy Library, reading to little ones as part of the Regatta Week. And when I'd finished and they all kind of potted off to go crabbing on the town quay or whatever, I went into the back room there and started researching the river, the history of the river and the wildlife and cormorants in particular. And I was amazed what I discovered about cormorants, not only what adaptable birds they are, how they've been around since the dinosaurs, how they kind of appear all around the world in many different climates, but also how much they appear in mythology and how much they seem to have inspired writers. So I found mythology, Irish mythology, where a cormorant on a church steeple is a bad omen. And then in Norwegian mythology, 3 cormorants flying together are meant to bring messages from the dead. And in fact, they also think that if you died at sea, you can return in the shape of a cormorant to speak to loved ones. And I also realised how much they appear in other literature. And the Bible, they're mentioned, I think, 4 times in the Bible, and they're always unclean. And they get a pretty bad press in Shakespeare too. He always uses them as a sort of synonym for greed, and they're voracious. And Milton has Satan disguising himself as a cormorant in Paradise Lost, devising death to them that lived. So I started to feel a bit defensive of these birds, and yes, I could see why they kind of filled people with dread. But equally, I thought it was interesting to maybe write a story where I could redress the balance a little bit. Which authors have you been inspired by? That is a difficult question. I studied English at university and have always read a great deal. So all the classics are there as bedrocks, if you like. But although I read a lot, I remember very little. So I quite often have to read and reread books. And in fact, during lockdown, I revisited lots of old friends, if you like. During lockdown, because I was homeschooling 3 children and with everything else going on, I wasn't really able to embark on any big projects, but I did write and edit lots of short stories. So because of that, I was looking at Anne Enright and George Saunders and Alice Munro, Elizabeth Strout as well. I would always read a new book by someone like Suri Hustvedt or Maggie O'Farrell or Rachel Cusk. When it comes to young adult books, I think I'm definitely more drawn to writers who really drill down into the interior landscape of their protagonists. So that would be writers like Liz Kessler, Sarah Barnard and Meg Graham. What was your favourite book when you were growing up? That one's easy. I read obsessively, time and time again, Jane Eyre. And it's interesting, when I first started sending this book out to reviewers, the word Gothic kept coming back. Piers Torday said it was a spellbinding slice of Cornish Gothic, and Joan Aiken's daughter said it was in the spirit of Joan Aiken and just as Gothic. And I was a little bit surprised by this because I was never particularly interested in Dracula or Frankenstein or any of those seminal texts. But when I thought about it, I did realise that both Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights, which are definitely favourites of mine, they're filled with hauntings and these isolated landscapes and these strong women who are emotionally quite overwrought, and I suppose that all fits the Gothic, so it makes sense after all. When you begin writing, do you have an ending in mind, or do you discover the ending as you write? So this is another way of asking, do I fly by the seat of my pants or do I plot? And I think the answer is I'm probably more of a plotter, but I really like to leave myself open to discoveries along the way. And if you plot too tightly, then you kind of strangle any opportunity for the story to take a different turn, which might enrich it. What I definitely do is know my characters inside out. I always make sure that I have a really, really strong sense of who they are, what they care about, the way they talk, so that when I start particularly writing dialogue, quite often it will take me in a direction that I hadn't anticipated, and I go with that and see where it will take me. So within this book, I would say that the environmental message got stronger and stronger, and that's because of two characters, Tamsin and Denzel, and because they cared so passionately about the world, I discovered it meant that the story itself also became one that was about the importance of living in harmony with wildlife. Are there other places in Cornwall you'd like to set a book? Yes, is the answer. The book I'm currently writing it's actually set in Putney in London because it's the last few weeks of an elderly man's life, but he is reminiscing a lot about her childhood growing up in Cornwall. So that was the 1950s around Mevagissey, and he also goes butterfly hunting a lot on the north coast up near Crackington Haven and Bude, so that sort of area. It's interesting, I'm very drawn to writing books set in Cornwall, I think because it's here that I see every day the link between human health, both physical and mental, and the health of the natural world. And I think I'm drawn to writing about people that really prioritise caring for the environment as well. In fact, I would like to read you just a little extra extract from the book, which is when Zed goes on her first beach clean. "What time do you call this?" yelled Tamsin. She was standing down by the shore in a sporty-looking turquoise bikini top and a wetsuit that was only pulled up as far as her waist. The neoprene arms flopped down to her knees and looked pretty similar to the ribbons of rubbery black seaweed draped over the rock by the toilet block, some of which was tangled up with bits of blue rope and 2 rusty fishing rods. Just below the loos were 3 overflowing bins and a heap of rubbish that seemed totally out of proportion to the size of the beach. Rusty cans, plastic bottles, crisp packets, an old kettle and a thigh-length Wellington boot. Zed could see more rubbish strewn in clumps all the way down to the water, and the smell of it hit her as soon as she stepped onto the sand. She tried not to breathe through her nose. Tamsin was holding up what looked like an enormous bit of green cloth, trying to fold it into a manageable size. "Better late than never," she said, sweeping back her hair with one hand whilst holding the corner of the cloth to Zed with the other. Up close, Zed could see the holes. Tamsin stepped back and tried to shake it out. The stench was appalling. "What the hell?" Zed threw it down and stumbled backwards. It was filled with rotting dead fish. "It's a gill net," said Tamsin, trying not to laugh. "The fish get halfway in and then the twine slips behind their gills so they can't escape." She tried shaking it out again. I should say, was a gill net. It's called a ghost net when it's like this, discarded by a fisherman. And this is the 3rd one we've had this week. "It's disgusting," said Zed. "You're telling me. We're used to all the plastic, especially the bottles, but this is something else." "Are the bottles really that bad? Usually, I mean." "Are you having a laugh? Do you know there are on average 150 plastic bottles littering every mile of beach in the UK? "No, I didn't," said Zed. or that each one will be bobbing around in the marine environment in 450 years? No, I didn't know that either. So you glug down a drink and it takes, what, 2 minutes? And that's your legacy. I meant, are they usually a problem on this particular beach? Well, it would be better if the shops didn't stock them in the first place, but at least most people use the recycling bins and the 1 or 2 left on the sand are picked up by one of us. She looked around and shook her head. But something really strange is happening here though, she said, because all of this, it's way worse than normal. So at this stage in the story, things aren't going at all well for Zed, and that is reflected back to her by what's going on the beach. And this is the opportunity, I think, that Cornwall affords, because it's the perfect place to look at the parallels between emotional, human trauma and trauma to the environment. And I suppose if there was going to be a takeaway message from the book, it would be, or at least one of the messages of the book, it would be that self-care and self-respect, learning how important those things are very much tied up with learning how important it is to care for our beaches and our rivers and the wildlife, because I suppose it's all of our futures. And if we learn to really respect and live in harmony with the natural world, then that means that we can find some sort of mental and emotional equilibrium as well. So the book and the audiobook narrated by Sophie Aldred should be available from libraries across Cornwall, and it's also available to buy in lots of independent bookshops locally as well. It's written for young adults, so has lots of adult themes, but from the reviews I'm getting, it's very much being enjoyed by their parents and their grandparents as well. And it is hopefully first and foremost a real page-turning mystery, but equally some of the issues that it takes in along the way would make it a good talking point across the generations. Thank you very much for joining me.